Hello, everyone. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening. Thank you for joining us for the third session of United by Sustainability, our webinar series here at the SCA. I'm Ellie Hudson. I'm the Director of Sustainability Partnerships at SCA, and joining me today is our featured guest, Kim Elena Ionescu, who is our Chief Sustainability Officer and leader of all things sustainability here at SCA. We worked together on the Price Crisis Response Initiative, SCA's response designed to address some really sobering and serious situations around coffee price and really research and understand this. And the focus on value distribution was a direct output of that. We aren't going to necessarily be talking about the PCR today, although if you're interested in that, we do have another webinar coming up, which I will share with you in just a minute. Okay. Just a little bit about this series. I think many of you see some repeat attendees as well as some new names on the list. So we really wanted to offer something in these very uncertain and difficult times, just as a place to come together, but also just focus on learning. So you may have noticed that we're addressing some topics that maybe haven't really been presented in this way before, and just maybe in some cases something new to learn where we really need that. And just, like I said, an opportunity to come together. We do offer this series on Tuesdays and Thursdays, and Thursdays we do it twice. So we have our offices in the LA area in the UK, so we usually use these same time zones. But Tuesdays, this is our first one, 3 a.m. Kim and I are both on the Eastern time zone, so it's 6, so not quite so bad for us. And we're joined also, I wanted to recognize Sierra and Pernilla from the SCA staff who are helping us run the webinar and helped in creation of the various promotions, as well as Julie Hausch, who works on all of this in the background with us, but is not on the webinar today. So as I mentioned, we like to point our attendees just with acknowledging the situation around COVID-19, give a chance to provide any updates. So I would just want to direct you to the dashboard section of where it says handouts. And if you open that up, you can kind of see there's 2 downloadable handouts here. One is United by Sustainability Resources and the other Fair Trade Living Income Strategy. So the United by Sustainability Resources 3 is a PDF that has links to some great resources that we will be talking about today. This also allows you don't have to take a bunch of screenshots and type in a URL, so everything that we reference is gathered there for you. But at the top of it, you will see that there is points you to the community-built reference section of the SCA website. This is an area where members of the community can submit their resources around COVID-19. So a lot of it is coffee specific, but a lot of it also is not. So anything that you might be thinking about, I would encourage you to use this. This database has grown to be quite large. There are a lot of excellent resources there, and I would encourage you to take advantage of that. Just a little bit about today and how things will go. We have 4 sections, or 4 sections, except it's actually 5. We just had our note on the emerging resources and updates on COVID-19. But of course, if you have any questions, feel free to use the chat window. Give you a brief introduction, and then Kim Elena is going to take us through 3 main topics around value distribution that we thought were most pressing, and also attendees of our previous webinar had voted for and asked about. So value creation, especially coffee and value, and equitable value distribution. And a note of one of the other things that was emphasized was real world examples of companies that work and have wrestled with this already. And so I'll point you to the other resource under handouts, which is the Fair Trade Living Income Strategy. And this is something that I think that after the webinar, I think if you were to read through this, you may see a lot of attention on different concepts of value distribution and more equitable value distribution that will make more sense. We also will be launching a few polls and welcome you to use the chat window or to raise your hand. So just kind of try to keep things a little bit interactive. And so here we are. This is sort of our key questions. And one of the things, I'm not going to go through and read these literally, but just as an insight of what we were thinking about when we built this session, but also, some of the ideas or concepts, questions that you might have and what you might be thinking about. Just as a note, if you do submit through the chat, we read your questions by identifying you as first name. So I might, Sierra said, ... If you don't want us to read your first name, just mention that when you submit the chat, and we won't use your first name, but by default we will. And then in the polls are confidential, so that is all just aggregated and put together. So the actual poll information will just show kind of as a percentage how people voted. You'll see how that works. All right, and so with this, I am going to hand it over to Kim Elena.
All right, great. Let me see about sharing my screen. Great.
All right, you should be good.
All right. Hey, everyone. Let me see if I can do this correctly. Play from start. Nope. It's not going to work, is it? I always have this problem.
Yeah, playing the slideshow.
Yeah. All right. Well, maybe I'll figure this out by the afternoon's session. But for now, yeah, this is the way that it always shows up when I go into presenter mode with GoToMeeting. So we'll just roll with it. So as Ellie said, my name is Kim Elena Ionescu. I'm the Chief Sustainability and Knowledge Development Officer for the Specialty Coffee Association. And today we're going to talk about value creation and equitable distribution of value. And we used that phrase already. We're all in it together. And I've heard that a lot over the past few weeks in the context of COVID-19. But I think that when we're talking about value, we really are in it together, especially when we start with this concept of value creation. But before we get into that, I did want to just take a second and address why we're talking about value right now, and a little bit about what we mean by value. So the background of this slide is a quick Google search that I did the other day on just the word value. And of course, what comes up is a dictionary definition that has to do with a regard, and it also notes that values are one way in which the noun value is expressed. And I think that's particularly relevant to a sustainability audience, because so often in sustainability, we do talk about shared values and what are our universal values, or where can we look to our values to guide us in our decision making, particularly in places where those values may have been previously separated from business decision making. I also did want to note that in that little graphic, I don't know if you can see this or not, but what comes up on the side of the screen in the little text box as the first image is an image of a little cartoon character person wondering over the cost of a cup of coffee and the market price for a cup of coffee. So I did think it was interesting that just even in that little Google search for value, something that came up immediately was something that was related to coffee. But we're talking about value here because, like Ellie mentioned, last year she and I spent the better part of the year of 2019 working on the SCA's Coffee Price Crisis Response Initiative, which was a response to low commodity futures prices for coffee and volatile commodity futures prices for coffee, and the effects that was having in the immediate term, particularly on coffee producers and producer organizations and producing side representatives. But because we're all in this together, we saw and we know that this has effects on all of us who are specialty coffee stakeholders, regardless of what our role in the value chain might be. So there's that word again, value. So that's why going into that year-long initiative, and certainly emerging from it, we have just been really focused on this concept of value and assigning value and creating value and distributing value and recognizing all of the different ways in which that appears and is relevant to to specialty coffee. So when we're talking about the value chain, one thing that I think would be useful to give you all a sneak peek of, and this will be particularly hard to see in the way that my slides are not taking up the entire screen here, but this graphic is what we have designed as a system map, and it's a product that came out of a number of different stakeholder input sessions that we did last year, particularly one that took place in Campinas, Brazil in July, immediately following the World Coffee Producer Forum event. And in that meeting, we really sought to bring people with diverse perspectives together to look at the way in which coffee moves around the world in this globalized system that we have. And that includes the actors and activities that we most commonly associate with the value chain. And those are depicted in a column in the middle there. And they consist of producing, if you start at the bottom, processing, exporting, importing, roasting, and brewing coffee. But then around the outside, we have all of these different actors, most of them represented by people or companies that of course are made up of people, and all of those actors have a role to play in this value chain too. So it's not just the activities that take coffee from wherever it is geographically grown to wherever it is geographically brewed and consumed. It relies on this whole network of different actors who all are in some way contributing to this process. So some of those are more obvious than others. If we think about workers, for example, workers are obviously contributing to every stage here, whether we're talking about farming and farm workers, or exporting, and we're talking about people who work on the dock loading the coffee onto a container ship, or if we're talking about brewing, and that's potentially a barista in a coffee retail shop. So workers are involved in every stage and adding value. But someone else, another one of these actors in this wheel could be someone like the media, and we could talk about the ways in which the media shapes the understanding of the public, of coffee drinkers, about coffee, and in this case about the value of coffee. But in addition to shaping the perceptions of coffee drinkers, we are all consumers of media in some way or another. So they're shaping our narratives about the business that we are all involved in also. So we believe that every one of these actors that appears on this wheel around that center column, all of whom are connected to those activities with different colored lines, we believe that all of these are actors that are providing and creating some kind of value into and putting that into the coffee system. And so that's, I think, an important place to begin, that recognition that everything and everyone who exists in this system is bringing some and creating some value. But then from here, we'll start to talk about what those different kinds of value are, and also about the distribution of that value between different actors in this system. So from here, I'm going to move into our first poll, assuming that this is something we can do. Ellie, let me know if I need to do anything to launch this poll. I wanted to ask you all to answer a question about which of these activities, which I hope you can see a little bit better here, you are most involved in, whether that's brewing or roasting, importing or exporting, processing, or coffee farming. I see the poll actually asks which activity, and you can select one or more. So you can select any number of them.
At about 55%, 60%.
Oh, great.
This is very interesting and not what I expected. 70%. We'll leave it open for another 10 seconds or so to give everyone a chance to vote. All right, I'm going to go ahead and close this. All right.
All right, so it looks like 60% involved in brewing coffee, 40% in roasting. So that's the larger participation from closer to the consumer side of the business. 20% importing or exporting, 13% processing, and 27% farming. That's a pretty good spread, a pretty diverse array of different activities represented in this webinar.
Yeah.
I hope that leads to some interesting questions at the end of this presentation. Okay, so great. I'm especially glad for that because we do have this. We are starting with this recognition that everyone is creating value. So, question: Can you still see my screen? Yes. No.
I can see it.
Okay, great. All right. So moving on from this poll, the next thing that I thought that we could spend a little bit of time talking about was the relationship between specialty coffee and value. Because over the course of this this price crisis response initiative, and as we are looking at the coffee system through the lens of the economic disparity or the economic unsustainability of coffee production activities, we could start in any number of different places. So many issues arise, and this is true of sustainability probably in any different context, but you may start entering into the discussion through the avenue of social justice or some sort of social sustainability issue. But quickly you realize that a lot of the social issues that an individual or a community would encounter are also environmental issues, that there isn't a bright line that divides social and environmental and economic sustainability, even though we often use those categories when we're trying to explain the different perspectives from which, or the different kind of categories for our sustainability activity. So when we were approaching sustainability from an economic perspective and a production side perspective, we quickly ran into the impacts of climate change and how that is exacerbating the price volatility and the challenges to producing coffee profitably. And then we began to think about what is the unique role of specialty coffee in this. If we acknowledge that every producer and every supply chain is unique, but that there are unifying factors here, and there are ways in which groups of producers or different types of supply chains experience challenges in similar ways. We as the Specialty Coffee Association really sought to identify what the role for specialty is. And that's specialty in the Specialty Coffee Association itself, a trade association with members and stakeholders all over the world, nonprofit organization, but also specialty coffee in the sense of the many stakeholders themselves. So businesses that are roasting coffee, businesses that are producing coffee, individuals who are workers at a coffee business. What is the role for this community of communities of specialty coffee actors? And so that's what brought us to value, because whether we're talking about any sort of different sort of specialty coffee beverage, and whether we're talking about it being served by a barista in a cafe or retail space, or a bag of whole bean coffee that's taken to the consumer's home and brewed there, which is probably a little bit more likely in these times that we live in right now. Specialty coffee is a higher value product. That's something that that differentiates it from the rest of coffee that exists out in the world from commercial coffee, commodity coffee, is this higher value that specialty coffee contains. And most frequently, when we discuss the additional value attributes of specialty coffee, the first one that comes up is value in terms of higher cup quality, or the taste quality and the taste difference of specialty coffee. But that's not the only thing that's driving the additional value that specialty coffee contains. I mean, I chose this picture not only because the drink here looks delicious, but because it has this really exquisite preparation. The attention to detail here is clear. Again, my guess would be that this is coffee that was prepared for a consumer by an expert at preparation, say a barista. And so the cups that they are using, the environment in which that coffee is being consumed, all of those things add value to the cup of coffee that someone is consuming. And likewise, the potentially the stories that go into the creation of that coffee, the provenance of the coffee, where it came from in the world, what the variety of coffee plant that produced this was, the name of the coffee producer. These are all different attributes that add to the final value of that coffee beverage. And because of that, that's one of the reasons that we say that everyone in the system is creating value in some way, because that is very much a united effort, or a product of many different of all of these different stages and all of these different actors performing different roles in this system that contribute to the higher value of specialty coffee. And we see not only that specialty coffee has a higher value proposition, but also over the past 20 years, how much that value has grown, how much specialty coffee has grown and taken off and really pushed the frontier for what the value for coffee is. So the next slide here is a graphic that the Specialty Coffee Association put together based on data that we have from our own research and also from the National Coffee Association of the United States. So that's why the percentage here is percentage of adults in the United States and not a global percentage. I think it would be probably even more interesting if we looked at a global percentage, and if we had data from the 3 years since we published this graphic. But you can see here that starting in 2001, that number in particular of the numbers of weekly and daily coffee drinkers have risen enormously. So these are people who are self-identifying as consumers of specialty coffee, and that's not using a strict definition for a point score or how the coffee was produced, but that this is the growth in recognition of specialty coffee that has occurred over the past 20 or so years, to the point where you can see that this is now a much more common activity, with fully more than 50% of coffee drinkers in the United States saying that they drink specialty coffee on a weekly basis, and almost that many in 2017 saying that they drink coffee on a daily specialty coffee on a daily basis. And so if we see that the specialty coffee is a higher value product, and if we see this growth, then it really does suggest that that over 20 years we have collectively created an enormous amount of value in this coffee system that didn't exist previously, because these numbers don't show that how many more people drink coffee than did. This is just people who are transitioning from drinking commercial coffee, say, to drinking specialty coffee. So here, I wondered if we could do another poll, and it might not be one where it might not look exactly like this in the poll, but to gauge what kind of value, thinking about your role, is important to you. Because great, as I just identified the additional value created in the coffee system over the past 20 years or so. This is this is additional monetary value. The price of a cup of coffee, of that latte from 2 slides ago, has undoubtedly risen in most markets. But there are other types of value too. Value is not just a different way of saying money. It includes financial value or monetary value, but also other types of reward for one's work or contributions. So I wonder, what kind of value is important to you?
I think there's a lot more to read, and especially because people can make more than one choice. So I want to leave this one open a little bit longer. We've got just over half voted. And you can also feel free to type any thoughts that you'd like to share. It doesn't have to be a question with the audience, or participate in the discussion through your chat window during this poll or anytime. All right, we've got up to 88%. So I'll give it about another 10 seconds, 92%. Just about everybody. All right.
Wow. Also super interesting. So so it seems like consistency and predictability. That's an interesting question. I'd love when we move into unmuting people and hearing from you all, to hear a little bit more about the value of consistency and predictability, especially in contrast to monetary value, because I think that in my experience and from the discussions that we had, especially over the last year, but in general, a lot of the a lot of conversations about value really start with money, and the thresholds for profitability, or for our webinars last week on Thursday were about living income and living wage. So it's very much assigning a monetary value and specific numbers to the work that people do and the value that they create, and that is critical, absolutely critical. But I think it also sometimes there's a risk of ignoring just like in sustainability, when we divide something into categories, we sometimes risk missing the interconnectedness of them. I think that here we see a lot of that interconnectedness play out in the responses, where all of these obviously are important. None of them got less than 36% in terms of the vote for importance, but that in contrast to monetary value being number one, it's that idea of consistency that is so important, and something that is really valuable, and maybe impossible to replace in terms of its value, or something that we really feel right now when we are faced with so many different unpredictable factors in our daily lives. So okay, well, we'll come back to that. Gret, it's a great poll. Thank you all.
Kim, we have a hand raised. So yeah, I thought I would try and call Hotan or Hutan. Are you there? Yeah, I saw your. Just unmute your microphone and you can start speaking. I saw their microphone flash green for a second there.
A mirage.
Yeah. And we have another question. Don asked, I'd like to know your opinion on how the consumer's perception of coffee value and price will change due to the current pandemic. Do you want to address that now?
I'm going to get to it in just
later?
a minute.
Yeah, okay.
I'll get to it in just
Let
a
me
minute.
just hide the results of the poll then, and we can carry on.
It's a good question, and something that, given when we're doing this this webinar, is something that I definitely do want to address. But I just want to finish, one thing, which is, sorry, I keep asking this. Can you see my screen? Which is how specialty coffee has created value, and then what that has looked like to date. So this next graphic here moves us from just talking about value creation into talking about a little bit about value distribution. So not only, what is the what is the total value, whether that we're talking about monetary value and the end price, or whether we're talking about the all of those different non-monetary sources of value, and how they all build up to that experience of a coffee consumer, maybe in a retail space, maybe if they're brewing coffee in their home, maybe getting delivery. But how that's divided is, I think, an equally important question to be thinking about, and I think that's especially true now. And this is where I want to get to to Dan's question about the perceptions of coffee consumers, and what we can expect to see in the context of the pandemic. So you can see here that we have four or five different bars. Yes, we have five. I missed the other one of them because of the way my GoToMeeting was configured. Starting in 1970, not looking at how the price of coffee has fluctuated, if we look at the price of a latte, for example, but how that total value of that latte, or that cup of brewed coffee has, or pound, kilo, has changed over time. So we can start with the top green box, and that would be others in importing countries. We could start with the blue box, which would be the farmer. And you can see, all the numbers add up to 100, but how much that distribution has changed over time. And if we look from 1970 to 2009, it's pretty stark to see how that share of blue, both blue shares, have diminished over time. That in 1970, in the 70s, coffee producers were capturing about 31% of the total value of a cup of coffee, and others in producing countries, so that might be processors. If we look at the system map, exporters, there's a 26, they're capturing 26% of the value. It's only more than half. And then the importing side was about half also. But that begins to shift. And by the time we get to the decade of the 2000s, or I guess that's the aughts, we have 80% of the total value of I guess now I see it's grocery retail. So a pound of coffee is staying in the country where it is consumed. So between the weight loss and import expenses, which are pretty small and have gotten smaller or stayed pretty much the same since the 70s, that share of others in importing countries, you would assume that that's where all the value has been added, or that's where the value comes from, according to our perceptions or consumer perceptions of value in coffee. And it isn't until the teens that we start to see that percentage or that trend change, and all of a sudden, there's a higher value or higher return to coffee growers, and a little bit more to the other actors in producing countries. But it's that that producer, that farmer number, that I think is a really important one to track when we're talking about the distribution of value. And we can look at the decade of the 2000s and say, well, there was another coffee price crisis that happened in the early 2000s, in 2002. So that's why, because the commodity future price was so low, that's why we have this particularly low percentage to coffee growers. And I think that would be true and fair, but Meanwhile, it's not like coffee consumption was slowing down during that time. There wasn't a demand side crisis. It's also not like the uh, the trend hadn't been going in that direction before that point. So I don't think it would be entirely fair to blame that low number or attribute that low number to the commodity futures market for coffee and those low prices. But while I think that that many people, and certainly we have some people here who are involved in the activity of producing coffee, could look at the distribution in the 2010 to 2013 period and see that it still looks like unequal distribution of value, or it looks like we might only be recognizing value in certain ways, and that there's value being created that's going unrecognized and unrewarded. We also see that there's potential hope there, because that those numbers can change. The trend line can shift, and I think that these are years that coincided with the growth of specialty coffee. So specialty coffee does have the potential to return a greater share of value and to return more value, recognize the value that's created by producers. But it doesn't. We also know that it doesn't always do that, because if we go back to that previous slide, I put it in here twice. We see the growth that's happened, and that hasn't been borne out in equal measure in the value that that producers have received. But most of the discussion that I've been doing about value and value creation has focused on the producing side, and to me that makes sense, not only because of the context of the coffee price crisis of the past few years, but also because that has been a persistent problem and a sustainability threat that's been recognized for now decades. But it's not the only area where risk and where exists, and where value is potentially going unrecognized and unrewarded. And the moment that we're living right now, this pandemic and the way that it has affected retail businesses, including coffee retail, including restaurants, has really laid bare how vulnerable the other side of the specialty coffee supply chain is too. That it isn't something where only producers are vulnerable, and everyone who works in those importing countries role, the other importing country activity, that everyone is in a more secure position, that everyone has that consistency that from our poll we know that we all crave. In fact, now we see just how few resources, how little security there is for so many retail business owners, and also of course for everyone who works in those businesses. And we're doing another series of webinars right now in our research department with the Coffee Science Foundation, and those have been based on the results of a survey that we did that included producers, but was more retailers and roasters from the US and Europe than from anywhere else responding to these surveys, that see the COVID-19 pandemic as a major threat, and in about 15% of cases, even an existential one, like it might well put them out of business. So we have been more focused in our assessment of vulnerability at a system-wide level on the vulnerability in production, and all the while there's been a lot of this vulnerability that has existed on the demand or consumer side, close to it, that because of the growth that we had been experiencing maybe went unseen. But to that question though about the consumer response to value in the context of the pandemic, I think that this graph is a good one to look at. I spent a lot of time last year looking at the commodity futures prices in the past couple of years and comparing the downward trajectory to graphs of the early 2000s, and noted the similarity in the direction of these graphs, and wondered about what we could learn from the last coffee price crisis. And I think that in this graphic we can look at the years of 2008, 2009, 2010. The kind of peak of the financial crisis here in the United States, since this is a US based specialty coffee survey. And we can potentially learn some lessons from looking at the graph through that lens. And when we do, we can see that in 2009, across all categories, the consumption of specialty coffee did decrease. So in weekly terms, it went from somewhere in the high 30% in 2007 down to slightly below 30% in 2009. But it didn't drop to zero, and it also rebounded after that point. So while I think that we are already seeing and will continue to see a change in the maybe the format in which people consume specialty coffee, I think that there's ample evidence of a real, to use those economic terms, go back to that first graph, like the price inelasticity of demand for specialty coffee. And so I think that while there's much to worry about, and on an individual level, whether you're a producer of specialty coffee or a retail business owner, there's a lot to worry about. Maybe existentially, I think that there's also, in more general specialty coffee terms, a lot of reason for optimism here. And finally, the last thing I'll say before I open it for questions is, I think that the often when we talk about value, especially when we're talking about distribution, but same thing is true when we talk about value creation, we use this metaphor of a pie and how a pie is divided. And when we're talking about value creation, we're talking about how to make a bigger pie. And over the past 20 years, we've seen the pie for specialty coffee, at the very least, thinking about those consumption lines, we've seen that pie grow, and it's grown a lot. And we've seen from the bar chart how that can potentially deliver higher returns to coffee growers, although maybe not fast enough, and certainly not universally. But the vulnerability that we see now on the consumption side, as well as the production side, I think makes it maybe impossible to ignore that the pie that we have in specialty coffee, all of this value, is not being distributed equally. It's not being, or equitably. There are people who are really struggling right now at every stage, but especially towards the end of these chains. And I think that makes it incumbent upon all of us who are specialty coffee stakeholders, who are invested in the future of specialty coffee broadly, as well as individually for our own livelihoods, to think about that concept of equitable distribution and how it is that we divide this pie, and where the slices are larger and where the slices may be so small as to be insufficient. Not only for the livelihood of the actor involved in creating that value, but also to the existence of, or their continuation in coffee individually and as an entire group. We have huge groups of vulnerable people, and in order for specialty coffee to continue, when we are all in this together, we have to address these collectively. So that's it. I see we've had a couple questions come in since then.
Yeah, and I think, Kim, I wanted to add to that. Those of you that attended last Thursday at the Living Income webinars, one of the things that came up consistently was the main researcher working on living wage at the retail level was urging retailers to be thoughtful about how they reopen, and that there is definitely much more of a sense of awareness on the consumer side of exactly how vulnerable the retail workers really are, in the fact that once we had to shut down that trade, because of the pandemic that people were losing income immediately and lost their jobs very quickly, and businesses were really in survival mode in a matter of days or hours. And I think that she was really urging retailers to be thoughtful about considering embracing that as a conversation in how they reopen, and pursuing a living wage, and really involving consumers in that discussion. So we did that session twice. It was recorded. Both of them were recorded. That section was pretty similar in both times. So either one of the recordings on that living income, living wage would be really valuable to go into some deeper detail on the role of the consumer. And we have another question from Jan, or maybe it's Jan, they asked, how do you see the actual rise up of coffee prices because of Corona? There are a lot of logistic problems. Harbors are closed, no workers, no transport facilities, etc. And I think we're all in this, we all want to know what's going to happen, and no one does. Kim, do you have anything that you wanted to respond to on that?
Yeah, thanks for the question, Jan. I think that this is a risky time to be, in some ways, to be talking about coffee price crisis and looking at the commodity futures market and the kind of global supply and demand for coffee for insight on what the realities being experienced by individuals are. Because we do see that the price for coffee is at a substantially higher level now on that futures market than it was a year ago or even 6 months ago. And in contrast to a lot of other commodities, agriculture and otherwise, coffee has been volatile, but at a higher level than many of us have been accustomed to seeing over the past couple of years. But a lot of that is kind of coffee with a capital C, or at a macro level. That kind of stockpiling that's happening is not of specialty coffee microlots. This is fears of just what you noted. Ports being shut down, the movement of goods being severely slowed, whether that's in coffee producing countries before it's exported, or in consuming markets like the European Union. We see so much such a slowdown happening, and people who are in the trade of coffee, or who are facilitating the smooth flow, are understandably trying to mitigate their risk by buying larger quantities of coffee and predicting a future shortage and trying to account for that now. But to an individual producer, while higher commodity futures prices are usually better than lower commodity futures prices, something that does provide a measure of stability, and that kind of consistency that we're looking for. I think that it would be premature to say that our problems are solved collectively, and especially looking at specialty coffee, because there is such an impact or a shock happening on the retail side of things, where so often those higher value experiences are created, those higher value products find their outlet. So much of that higher value is about the environment for preparation and the experience of drinking that coffee. So I think that it will really challenge us in specialty to whether that's from the production side or the the supply or the demand side, to continue to think about the ways in which we are adding to the value of that product, if our goal is to continue to increase it, as well as to look at what the needs are, and the gaps and the threats to our collective sustainability as a specialty industry.
Thanks,
so I guess
Kim.
my short answer is while prices may continue to rise, I don't think that is giving much security to individual specialty coffee producers. All right. Are there any other questions? Even just comments on value and how value is, your own perception of it may be changing. That question about consistency and stability is one that I was surprised by that answer, and that the importance of that value to this group. If anyone has any, sort of a rationale for why you chose that one and maybe didn't choose some others. I'm not going to call on anyone. Of course, I couldn't, because we don't know who said what in the poll. But we do these webinars to share what we have learned with the community, but also to hear from you all, and to hear how your perceptions are changing.
As just a final note, I did share the COVID resources page, as well as just a preview for the next webinar in this series. And as we're kind of winding down here, we're trying to offer, as you can tell, like these sessions at different times, and we don't collect the data on where people are. So we thought we would just ask you, where are you joining us from? And you can see I obviously had to combine some of them because of having only 5 choices. So some of them are grouped together because of having a somewhat similar time zone. I obviously do know that there's a difference between Asia and Australia, New Zealand, Oceania, and Middle East and Africa are not the same, but somewhat similar time zones. So that's the rationale here. So we just kind of wanted to see where people are joining us, and then how that changes at the different times, just to try and just reach as diverse and broad audience as possible. All right, 85% voted. I'm going to close. Great. Thank you very much. And we hope to see you on Tuesday or next Thursday. Thank you, Kim. Thank you,
Thank
Sierra.
you, everyone. Thanks, Ellie.
Okay, bye-bye.
Bye.